Over the coming weeks, I'm going to be doing a series of videos about maintaining and repairing a Tascam 464, but before I start to do that and eventually produce a demo song showing the audio quality, thought I'd begin by just talking about the specifications of this unit in their own right and also in relation to other units that Tascam made. So I'm not absolutely sure when this came out, but I'm pretty sure it's about 1992, something like that. I know that 1992 is when the 488, which is of the same generation, it's got a very similar visual design, product design to it, that's when that came out. I believe also the original 424 is a contemporary of this, it's got a very similar layout. Now, if we're talking about the complexity of the 4-track cassette recorders that Tascam made, the absolutely most complicated one they made was the 644, which I think is just slightly earlier than this, and it had significantly more mixer channels. It had a digital interface for how you linked the mixer channels to the tape tracks. It directly implemented MIDI synchronization. In my opinion, that unit was actually a bit over-engineered, and I hated that interface. I mean, I'm saying that from the perspective only ever having had 688 and 644s where there was some problem with that. Basically, there's like a programmable chip down in there and that seemed to have got corrupted, or there's like a relay broken in there, and I never really got to the bottom of it. But I found the whole process of multiple use buttons that aren't intuitively labelled in combination in order to do things that you could just press two buttons on one like this kind of annoying. So I kind of tend to ignore the 644 and think of it as this kind of interesting aberration in the history of Tascams. I'm more inclined to think of this unit, the 246, which preceded it in the mid-80s, and the 424 Mark III, which came later in the 1990s, is all more or less equivalent in their features. There are differences in size and portability. I personally prefer the 246 out of those three because even though it's bulkier and heavier, it's got a two-band parametric EQ as opposed to high shelf, low shelf, one-band parametric mid. I also like the lit analog VU meters more than I like either the liquid crystal display on this unit or the backlit liquid crystal display on the 424 Mark III. This one and the 424 Mark III have got XLR inputs, which is, it's nice to have balanced inputs. I'll say more about that in a second. 246 didn't have that. Yada, yada, yada. But basically, you're getting roughly the same features with all three of those, i.e. you can, to some extent, EQ and pan your effects returns. So you've got the option of two mono effects returns that you can place within the stereo field, or a true stereo effects return, say you've got a stereo reverb. Got rehearsal facilities, memory, it's dual speed, you've got switchable DBX, you've got a liftable DBX, that's the noise reduction control on channel 4, so that if you have an external sync unit but you still want to use noise reduction on channels 1 through 3, you can lift the DBX, which gets in the way of using sync units for channel 4, and use that as your sync track. So in all of those ways, I would say those three models, the 464, the 424 Mark III, and the 246 are kind of similar to each other. And they're, in my opinion, the most versatile and best 4-tracks. In an ideal world, if you're in the market for one of these, it's one of these three models that you would be looking for. I mean, I've got a great affection for the 244. I like the 414 Mark II because it's still dual speed and it's like really portable. I like the Porta one even though it's single speed because it's battery powered. I like the 424 because it's got 3 speeds. It's got high, normal and low. But all things taken into consideration, if I could only have one Tascam 4-track, then I'd be more or less equally happy to have one of these or a 424 Mark III or a 246. Let's talk about all the features going from like the top left corner down to the bottom right, and then we'll look at the outputs on the back. Oh, and that's something else I should say about the three models I mentioned. There are other ones that have tape outs, but a lot of the smaller ones with mechanical transports I mean, for instance, this Porto 7, which is late 80s, I believe, it doesn't have tape outputs. The great benefit in the digital age of having one like this, where the all four tape tracks go unmolested out through four separate RCA outputs on the back, is that say you're using this almost as a kind of analog warmer, you're doing either recording in this or you're dumping some recordings that were made on another device or a digital device onto cassette, and you want to be able to EQ or pan or process those four tracks separately without having synchronization problems, drift problems, by which I mean, like, say you were to record one track and then another track and then a third track and then a fourth track consecutively into a digital machine, you would find that they're all slightly different lengths, and because there's very subtle variations in those lengths because of the inconsistency of the electric motor, then they would be subtly out of time and drifting away from each other. Whereas with this, you can record the four channels into four inputs of the sound card and then into your DAW, your digital audio workstation. And although those tracks would be subject to those kind of inconsistencies due to the electric motor, they'd be subject to them in the same way. The four of them would line up together. So if you're at all interested in integrating one of these machines with a digital setup, then really you want to be looking for one of these ones that's got the 1, 2, 3, 4 separate tape outputs. And this one, 424 Mark III, and the 246 all fit that bill. There's other ones, and the Mini Studio's got 4 direct outs. I think can't remember whether the 424 does. I haven't had one of them for a while, but I'm pretty sure the 424 Mark II does. Anyway, going from the top left, we have either unbalanced line inputs or XLR balanced inputs. The balance thing, basically, if you don't know the difference between balanced and unbalanced cables, it's to do with noise cancelling. The same way a humbucker pickup on the guitar cancels the buzz that you would get in a single coil pickup, a balanced cable will kind of cancel some buzz and hum. Usually in a scenario where I'm using something like this, the cables are so short, so using so little equipment with it, it's not that much of a consideration, but certainly for like the convenience of being able to just use a standard microphone cable, this is really nice to have. We've got gain, and that'll go from, you can usually use that down there, and so long as your master fader and this fader is somewhere in that shaded area between 7 and 8, then a line level signal won't require any extra amplification. But for microphones, you can turn that up. You can get nice well, it depends on your definition of nice, but you can get distortion effects by turning that up and turning that down. Which can be fun to experiment with if you're into really awful sounding music like what I am. Then the EQ section, it's 3 bands. We've got a high shelf, a low shelf, and a parametric mid. So there's a kind of bell shape, if you like, in the response curve that we can sweep between 250 Hz and 5000 Hz. I kind of prefer the 2 bands parametric EQ that you got on the 244 and the 246. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd have that and a high shelf and a low shelf. But it's still pretty cool. You can get a lot out of that. And then we've got 2 effect sends. So you can either treat those as 2 mono effects. You could have a delay and a reverb. And although the effect themselves are monaural, you could send them back in these 2 channels and say you could have like your reverb over here when the source that's being reverberated is over here. And you could have your delay dead center even though the signal you're feeding into the delay is over here. So you still get a kind of a stereo field. But if you had a stereo reverb and you wanted basically to make your stereo drum track sound authentically like it's sitting in a room and you've got some room simulation and some outboard bit of gear, then what you would do is you would send an equal amount of signal to both effects ends, and then on your effects return you'd have them panned hard left and right. Basically there's output for effects at the back here, so you'd have 2 cables going into your effects unit, and then the output of the effects unit is going in here. And you would have the facility to add some high shelf and some low shelf to that EQ. That's not as versatile as it is on the 246 or the 424 Mark III, where you got a parametric mid, so there wouldn't be a blank space there on the equivalent mixer. You've still got those mid options, and the 244 you've got the same 2-band parametric EQ in all 6 channels. But it's still a lot more versatile than the auxiliary circuit on a lot of the Tascam Portastudios. And obviously you can pan your signal. You've got the option over here, and you can just take directly from each mixer strip to the corresponding track. So you can say that what's coming on channel 1, regardless of what this fader says, is going to go onto track 1 of the tape. Whatever comes on channel 2, regardless of what the pan says, is going on to track 2 of the tape. Or what you can do, say you've got 4 drum mics, or even for that matter 6 drum mics, you could pan them to make a stereo image, and then you could record that in tracks 1 and 2, and then say you're overdubbing another stereo instrument, let's say a piano. Again, you could have a multi-mic set up, and then you could make a kind of stereo mix of like 6 mics and put that onto channels 3 and 4. So you've got 2 ways you can use that. That's pretty versatile. You know, it's more versatile than, say, a Tascam 244, where you can record all 4 tracks simultaneously or 2 at a time, but you don't have this thing where you can kind of use the mixer section as a sub-mixer to make a multi-channel stereo image of an instrument. So that's an advantage of this unit. We've got a separate tape queue, so that, I mean, basically when you've got an instrument mic'd up, the level that the tape sees is a mix. It passes through this gain trim and through this fader and the master, and so if you turn that up but then you pull these down, then the signal that goes to tape will be quieter. And for those reasons, it's not really ideal to use the mixer to mix the signal that you're hearing in your headphones as you record something. But we have a separate tape queue, so we just set the levels of the instruments. It's monaural, but that can give you a different blend to what you might want to listen back to, and the way that these controls are set up doesn't affect the gain structure that's being recorded to tape. We have a pitch control, so if you can do creative effects like this, like if you turn it up and then turn it down, then you'll get almost a pitch wheel effect on the recording. You know, I'm not a huge Mac DeMarco fan, but I understand he has popularised that technique. And, you know, you see people like, I'm maybe going to say his name wrong, the guy from Nine Inch Nails is Alessandro Cortini, just recording a drone on each of the 4 tracks. And so he's got 4 notes or 4 pads and then bending them to get extra notes. So it's fun to use it that way. But I think what it was originally intended for is, say you recorded a piano and it was sharp of concert pitch, then you could adjust for that there and then put it back to 0, and it will be in tune with your other instruments and so on. And then you've got the tape speed control. That means that this is going to be compatible with really recordings that are made in any other multitrack. Say you've got demo tapes that you made in a Fostex, which is using Dolby noise reduction instead of DBX. DBX2 is what this uses. You can lift the DBX. The standard commercial speed is 1 7/8 inch per second. So, you know, commercial cassettes you could play in there, or from a cheaper 4-track, it would play it in there. You just put it in normal speed with the noise reduction off. But if you'd recorded something high speed with DBX on in a 244, and you put that in high speed, put the DBX in, and that'll work fine. So that's kind of a compatibility thing. I mean, if you're very short of tapes, then you're obviously going to get twice as many recordings on each tape using the normal speed, which is 1 7/8 inch per second, as you would if you're using 3 3/4 inches per second up here. But the cool thing from, if you're coming at this from a kind of Heinbach Amulets point of view, is you can record something really high and then do it half speed, and it'll sound an octave lower, and also it'll sound kind of grainy and lo-fi. Equally, you can record something at the low speed and then play it back, and it'll pitch up and it'll go all kind of warbly and chattery. So there's a lot of fun to be had there. Because it's a digital control, then we've got quite a lot of functions here to do with punching in, rehearsing, memory locations. Return to 0 is much more sophisticated than the auto stop on some of the earlier Tascam Portastudios. Like, for instance, the 244, if you put on auto stop, what it'll mean is if you rewind towards 0, it'll stop there or nearly there. Sometimes it stops at like 998 or rather than 0000. But if you fast forward, it'll ignore 0. And that's the extent of it. Whereas on this, you press RTZ, which stands for return to 0 once, and whether you're before that, the 0, as far as the count is concerned on the tape, or after it, then this will automatically take you to that point, and it'll do it much more accurately. Locations 1 and 2 work the same way. I mean, I think basically this is apart from the buttons are in a slightly different place and it's a LCD screen rather than a backlit LCD screen, these work in pretty much the same way as the transport controls on a Tascam 424 Mark III, and I did a video demonstrating those if you want to check that out. Moving on to the back, so we've got an input specifically so we can use, I'll maybe put notes in the description about what you can use, but I think you can use an external box and do like SMPTE or MIDI based. It's not a facility I've used much, to be honest. I think I experimented with it years ago, but certainly not recently. But basically, what this is doing is it's turning on and off the noise reduction on channel 4, and then you can use these in-outs to make sure that the audio you record from tracks 1 through 3 is lined up in a consistent way with like MIDI gear. Probably it would work with those like pocket operators that Teenage Engineering that are kind of popular these days, and so on. And then this is you can turn off the noise reduction for all 4 tracks. Some people like the sound of DBX. I'm one of those. I quite like the way that it kind of dulls the high ends and quasi compression you get from using it. But if you're the kind of person that would rather record hot in order to avoid too much noise floor and don't mind a little bit of hiss, then you can turn it off on all 4 channels. We've got option for a 2-track in, so that's just really like, you know, you could put a drum machine in to rehearse along when using this as a, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a realistic application, but the same way like a lot of things you can put like a stereo source like an MP3 player or a tape player into it. You've got the option to do that. There's an output for the Q mix to send it somewhere else to say it's a headphone amplifier so other performers can hear the Q mix rather than the stereo mix. Then monitor out, similar facility, line out, that's, you know, your stereo mix if you're going to make a recording onto cassette. Your tape outs, use this for calibration, but also if you want to simultaneously record all 4 tracks of the tape into digital medium for further processing. These are the outputs for your effects units, and you would then just return them on one of these 2 channels here. And finally, we've got an insert effect option for channels 1 and 2. So there's certain effects, like for instance EQ or compression, where typically you'd want to process the whole signal rather than blending a wet and a dry signal together. And so you can use a Y cable in these 2 sockets, and it'll allow you to do it, but only for these 2 channels. As you can see, I'm quite keen on this machine, so I'll just give you a couple of caveats from the point of view of maintaining them. They have a bit of a fatal flaw, which is basically there's a plastic part in there that's to do with choosing which mode it's in and whether the magnetic heads and the pinch roller are retracted or not. And I guess they got, back in the day, they got it from a different supplier, because there's a system of 3 gears with little teeth, and 2 of them age fine, and 1 of them is liable to crumble into dust. And because Tascam aren't supplying those anymore, we're kind of at the mercy of third parties who are, you know, some of them are making them out of resin, some of them are making them out of, they're 3D printing them. And yeah, they can be pretty expensive. I mean, one time I paid £60 for this tiny little piece of plastic to get one of these working. I didn't have any option, and I hadn't spent a lot on the machine itself. I mean, in fact, that little bit of plastic was more expensive than the entire rest of the machine. And it did work fine. I sold that one on, and you know, I know that the buyer was happy with it. But be aware of that, as sometimes if you see one of these listed, and it says, oh, you know, the transport doesn't work, you can go, aha, well, maybe it's just the rubber belts. That's giving me a cheap and easy fix. If you're going for this one, you need to be a bit more cautious about paying a low price for a faulty one in case it is that problem. Replacement parts seem to be a bit cheaper at the moment. There's a maker in Germany making them for like 25 quid each, which is still actually a rather extortionate amount of money for a tiny little piece of plastic, but it's a damn sight cheaper than I've paid for it before. As long as you take that particular fatal flaw into account, what else do we need to know? Yeah, sometimes these knobs go kind of really gooey. The rubberized surface of these don't age as well as the hard plastic knobs from some other models, but I mean, that's a purely cosmetic thing. But generally speaking, this is one of the best 4-track cassette recorders you can get, if you can get one in good order. So in future videos you can watch me do a full teardown on this. I've actually got 2 of them in, so I'll be covering a variety of problems that arise, and yeah, eventually I'll use one of them, I'll make some kind of demo song.